This is Pete Jones, and you are listening to the Dragons Are Real podcast. Welcome to a new episode. This episode I'm going to be talking about the French game that's been translated into English, Epees and Sorcellerie, or translation means swords and sorcery. There's been a bit of a delay between this episode and the last one. A couple of reasons really. Real life has gotten in the way. We've had an illness in the family, so having to deal with that. And also at work, my company has been, it's a family-run business, and it's been taken over by a larger company, so everything's up in the air at the moment. We don't know if we're going to have our jobs, what our conditions are going to be, so all a little bit hectic, but hey-ho, game on. Gaming-wise, last week I had my fourth session of Lamentations of the Flame Princess set in the Stonehouse dungeon, and it was also the second time I used the Arkenforge Master's Toolkit. It was quite a session. Only had 5 out of the 8 players last session, so there was less people around the table, but nevertheless it was none the quite game-wise, plenty happening. Several battles, and they foraged deeper into the dungeon. As for the Master's Toolkit, it's working really well. Had all the maps set up ahead of time, and what really saves a lot of time now is you can put all the room information into the quest module, so that each room has got an icon on it which is visible on the GM screen, and whenever they go somewhere new I can just click on that and I've got all the information on the screen, no flicking back between 2 or 3 different documents. I've got all the monster stats already on there. I've also put several hundred tokens on. Some kind soul on Reddit put all the GM 5th edition monsters as tokens, and any ones that were missing from the Labyrinth Lord I've added myself, so I've got all the tokens added there, so I can put those on the screen, which saves some time. For the TV screen I had a piece of acrylic cut, so that lays on top of the TV screen now, so that protects the TV screen from any scratches. I've got the MDF figures which I've talked about in the previous episode. The players are using those characters. And what I did do this time is I had light sources, and I had the Fog of War, which was dynamic Fog of War. So I had a light source for each character that was holding a lamp. So the source of the light is set, and wherever the figures are on the map, then I put the light source beneath them. So you've got the rooms coming out in front of them, and as they progress down the dungeon, the darkness closes behind them, and it does cause them some problems. They have to keep referring to the map. They forget what's behind them, so that works really well. The sound effects works fine early on in the evening, but our gaming room is massive, so we've got like between 50 and 70 players in there, so as the night gets on, it does get harder to hear the audio, but doesn't really detract from the game at all. It's that interactive. The players all seem to enjoy it. For me, it is a lot easier to run using the dynamic tabletop, and as I get used to the software, it's getting easier. But I'm only going to use it for my monthly games at the moment, because obviously it does take time to design everything within the Games Master Toolkit, and not knowing where the characters are going makes you sort of want to prep a bit far ahead. With our Lamentations game, I've added something else in. I just got the feeling that clerics and magic users in Lamentations, are, especially at first level, are not as useful to the party maybe as the other members, with them only having one spell, and magic users even worse because they're not choosing the spells, it's a random dice roll. So I've let the players use cantrips, and the way I've done this is use a minor effect. So for example, heal light wounds. What I've allowed them to do is, by placing their hands on someone, they can cure them of 1 hit point, or they can stop the bleeding, but they're only allowed to do it to a character once per day, to the same character. They can use the same cantrip on different characters, but stops them each turn, just healing them a 1 hit point, 1 hit point, 1 hit point. It also means that the magic users, if they've got like climb, So instead of them climbing up a sheer cliff face, they can climb, a 6-foot wall or cling onto a wall when running away from something. So it's only minor little effects, but it gives the magic users a little bit more to use, and makes them feel more like magic users. Another game I've managed to get in down the club is the narrative dice system from Fantasy Flight, being Star Wars. I've got Star Wars Age of Empire, and I've also got the generic Genesis book, but I've not managed to play a game yet. I've read the books, but I think it's one of those games that unless you've played it with someone else, it is quite difficult to get your head around, because it's such a different game to normal role-playing games, and it uses the narrative dice system. But one of the lads on the club put on a beginner game of Age of Rebellion. There's a starter set out there which I managed to pick up as well. And basically, when you roll the dice, you roll your dice for your abilities, and you have different special dice, but you also roll the difficulty at the same time. So instead of going against a target number or the GM rolling dice, the player rolls all the dice together. And as a result of the dice, you have successes, you have failures, and they cancel each other out. So you can quickly see whether you succeeded at doing something. And the GM can alter the difficulty and the dice that you have to roll against you. Or say against you, with your dice roll, which are either difficulty dice or challenge dice and setback dice. The thing that takes a little bit of getting used to is when you have advantage and disadvantage. That gives the player some narrative of how things are going. Overall, I really enjoyed the system. Once you get your head around it and you play a few dice rolls in, and you start to grok how the advantage and disadvantage works, and it does make it a bit easier. So yeah, I was impressed with that. So maybe I'll get to run Genesis or Age of Empire at some point as well too. So on to Epees and Sorcellerie. This was a game originally written in French back in 2009, and this is a translation made by David Macaulay. Interestingly, David Macaulay doesn't speak French, and from what I can gather, the majority of this book has been translated using tools like Google Translate. Now, it sounds as if it's going to be a disaster, but actually it's not. So Epees and Sorcellerie is written by Nicolas Dessau. Nicolas Dessau, he wrote the one-page RPG, Search of the Unknown, which is probably well known, a very light system. So Epees and Sorcellerie is a 2d6 system, and it's swords and sorcery. Character creation is very simple. You have the standard abilities: strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution and charisma. And these are all represented of a score between 2 and 12. So to get the characteristics of those 6 abilities, the players roll 2d6, giving them that score. Each of the abilities has a modifier depending on the score. So 6 to 8 is a 0 modifier, 9 to 10 is +1, 11 to 12 is +2. And then the other way, 4 to 5 is -1, and 2 to 3 is -2. Unlike in other D20 games, the modifiers are to rolls. For example, dexterity applies to attack rolls in missile combat. There are 3 classes in Epees and Sorcellerie: warrior, priest and sorcerer. And there is an optional rule there. You can also have dual class characters. Damage, as you would imagine, is all by d6. So for example, a warrior at level 1 would add +1 to their attacks, and the hit dice is 1d6 plus 1 hit points. And the levels of the characters goes up to level 12 for all 3 classes, and experience is by experience points. There are 3 or 4 points in each character's levels where they get some sort of special ability. And for example, warrior is multiple attacks, courage, instinct and terrifying presence. Otherwise, it's just increases in the hit dice. So priests are like your clerics, and they start off with 0 spells at level 1, so that's really old school. and sorcerers have 1d6 hit dice, not 1d4 like in other systems. And again, there's little bits in here, weapons and armour, and there's constraints on what weapons and armour they can use. For example, the priest can use normal armour and a shield, but has to use weapons prescribed by his religion. Races included in the book are elf, halfling, dwarf and orc. And each one of these races has a description, and some of them have got special abilities. For example, dwarves can see in the dark as well as full daylight. They're good for languages, very resistant to magic and supernatural powers, and certain creatures only cause half damage against dwarves. For example, ogres, trolls, giants and similar creatures. So each one of the races has some special abilities. Now, armour class is dealt with differently in this system. Armour class is equal to a person's dexterity. So if you've got a dexterity of 12, that is your armour class. Leather types also gives you an armour class. So for example, leather is armour class 8, chainmail is armour class 10, and plate mail is armour class 12. However, if your dexterity is high, that negates you the reason for wearing armour, because armour restricts your movement. If you don't wear any armour, you have a movement of 4, while down to plate mail, you've got an armour of 1. So this encourages characters with high dexterity not to use armour because it gives them no benefit. But on the flip side, if you have a really poor dexterity, then it is worth you getting some armour to increase your armour class at the expense of slowing you down. It covers the normal sorts of alignments, but they're split into 3: law, chaos and neutrality. There are no skills at all in the system. Players are encouraged to use their backgrounds to decide what they're skillful at and whether they're good at things. The difficulty is set by the GM, and because it's a 2D system, is moderate is 7, which is your average roll on 2d6. Easy is a roll of 5, hard is 9, and very hard is 11. Characters also have a competence, and that gives you a +2 if it's within your competence by either your class, race or past experience. And also, for every 3 levels a character is, they get a +1 bonus. So level 4 to 6 gets a +1 bonus, and so on. When there's an active opposition between 2 characters or creatures, it's the character with the highest ability score that rolls the dice first. And if they succeed, the other fails without having to roll the dice. However, if you do fail your roll first, then the opponent can roll, and if successful, can overcome the opposition. There's also rules for group actions. They're talking about how to run stealth, and there's like common actions. And you're using your 6 abilities. So for acrobatics, you would use dexterity. For deception, you would use your charisma. And basically, you're rolling your 2d6, adding your ability bonus to see if you can succeed. There are also saving throws. Saving throws are equal to your attack bonus. And to succeed in any saving roll, you must roll at least 10 on the 2d6, modified by your ability, race and certain spells. So for example, your constitution modifier is added to any saving throws to resist poison, spells, powers that cause instant death, while your dexterity would be added to leaping out the way of a fireball, or escaping a dragon's breath, or trying to avoid a trap activation. So the author recommends it's possible to use the saving throw in as many particular ways as possible, and be inventive with it. There are rules for fatigue, fire, falls, drowning, all the normal stuff. There's a table for initial reaction of NPCs, and being 2d6, it's 6 to 8 is neutral, less than 6 is negative or aggressive, and greater than 8 is positive or friendly. And experience is awarded. Each monster defeated is worth 100 XP points per level, keeping it nice and simple. And it recommends you divide the XP amongst the characters. So, on to combat. So the whole chapter on combat, the sequence of rounds is in a set order. So all movement is done first. So each combatant may move their full combat movement rate, or if they're not engaged, move twice that speed. Interestingly, elves can fire a bow during this phase while moving, but no others can. Once all movement is finished, it's on to spells, so any spellcasters or counter spells are cast, and I'll come on to spells and counter spells after. And spells take effect immediately. If two spellcasters launch their spells at the same time, then it's considered that both spells act simultaneously. Then missile attacks. Stationary combatants who already fired during the movement phase can do so again, and ranged attacks are not possible if you're engaged. And you would have to wait till the start of the next round before drawing your melee weapon. After all missile attacks are resolved, then we move on to melee attacks. Any motionless targets who are already struck during the movement phase may do so again. And finally we have the morale phase. So same with with ability checks, you roll your 2d6 plus your attack modifier, and whether if you're in melee you'd add your strength modifier, or if you're using range combat you'd use your dexterity modifier. And you have to beat the armour class of the intended target, not equal it, beat it. And always both combatants roll the dice simultaneously. However, only the one who rolls the highest hits. So if you've got two creatures, or a character creature in combat, both would roll their attack rolls, add their relative modifiers, but only the one that rolled the highest would hit. The other one would have deemed to fail. If both of them roll the same score on their attack roll, then they both roll for damage. So, if you both hit, it's the highest of the two rolls that hits. If you both fail, nothing happens. And if you're both the same, then they both roll for damage, deemed to be causing damage at the same time in the combat. And then the damage is 1d6 plus any strength modifiers if applicable. If you're adding using a two-handed weapon, you get an extra +1. And you reduce the amount of damage from the person's hit points. Hit points are calculated by class. There's also some styles of combat which are thrown in. It tells you how to use a weapon with a shield. So for a shield gives you a +1 to your armour class, but you may also parry a ranged attack by rolling 2d6 plus your attack modifier, and for rolls higher than that of the attacker, the projectile has been embedded into the shield rather than the defender. There's also rules for two-weapon combat and armed combat. Magic. If we go on to magic, as per other old school games, you have got a number of spells which are allowed at each level, and magic users have to prepare those spells each day. People who are the target of a spell have got the chance of a saving throw unless the spell dictates otherwise. Spells also have a secondary effect, and these are like your cantrips in other games. So basically, as I've adopted in my Lamentations game now, whenever a spell is prepared, the caster can use small visual special effects depending on the type of spell. So for example, in the book it says if you've got a fireball, the magic user can light a small fire or pipe in this way. If somebody's got a choose summon monsters spell prepared, then they can summon a small mouse. And it's to be agreed with the GM what the spell effects are. There's rules for spell creation, magic scrolls, and then a list of spells. And there's 5 levels of spells for priests, and the majority of them are your standard healing, detect traps, that sort of thing. And then sorcerer spells, there's 6 levels sorcerer spells. Again, your similar sort of old school type of spells. Then there's a bestiary at the back, and all monsters are defined by a few small stats. So if I give you something simple as a goblin, because everybody knows what a goblin is in Epees and Sorcellerie, a goblin has a hit dice of 1 minus 1, so that's 1d6 minus 1. Its attacks rolls are made at -1. It has an armor class of 8, a movement of 2, an alignment of chaos, and then a small paragraph below it. These small stocky humanoids with long ears and a bushy beard live in caves or underground places in tribes of several hundred members. They are just over 3 feet high. Each tribe is ruled by a king or a queen. So there are a number of monsters, your standard skeletons, trolls, vampires, that sort of thing. There's what I like about it, to go with the old school, there's just 5 different stats for each monster, or 4 really, because alignment isn't a stat. And remember, your XP, you're getting 100 points per hit dice of the monster, so a level 2, a hit dice 2 wolf would give you 200 XP. Some monsters, which have got special abilities, get extra for XP points, and that's denoted in the rules by a bracketed number after the hit dice. So, for example, hit dice on the wraith is 4, brackets 5, so that means they fight as hit dice 4 and have hit points for hit dice 4, but for XP they have 5, considered 5 hit dice worth of XP, which would be 500. And finally, there's a section on magic items. And in the back of the book is just a list of spells, a character sheet, and an index. So that is Epees and Sorcellerie. It is a simple system, designed to be simple. Beauty of it is you don't need any polyhedral dice, so if you could easily run one of these games with just a couple of a d6 each and be up and running. And considering it's been made, translated from Google Translate or other translating software, there's not too many complicated, too many mistakes in it I can see, or ambiguities. Quite often you find if you get a manual from an electronic item from somewhere like China that's been translated with a translation tool, it makes no sense whatsoever. This isn't the case with Epees and Sorcellerie. So this is the English version of the first edition of Epees and Sorcellerie. There is a second edition of Epees and Sorcellerie, and that has not been translated to English. However, there is a website which I'll put a link to in the show notes, where somebody has done some work on the second edition with the differences. And from what I can gather, it's only a few minor differences. I think might be some spells differences, but a couple of other minor things. But I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. So that is Epees and Sorcellerie, a nice OSR style game with using 2d6. So if you're a fan of Traveller or Barbarians of Lemuria or Troika, and like the 2d6 bell curve, then Epees and Sorcellerie is worth checking out. The PDF is free from Lulu, and the print version is available cheaply from Amazon as print on demand, which is where I got mine from. So I'll leave notes in some links in the show notes, so feel free to check it out.
You've been listening to the Dragons Are Real podcast. You can contact me by leaving a message via the Anchor app, or visit the podcast website, petejones.neocity.org, or on OSR Anchorites at the Audio Dungeon Discord. Thanks for listening. The opening music is Siesta by Jazar. The closing music is Controlled Distress by BizBaz Studio.